We are going to begin here with our large square-headed brush, grabbing a little bit of primary yellow, a good amount, or rather equal amount of titanium white, mixing those two together. Then I'm going to take that pigment that I have, grab some additional titanium white, mix it with that, and now I'm going to apply this very bright, very desaturated yellow to my sky here up at the top. This is going to be applied fairly easily because we are using the large square-headed brush, and it does hold a good amount of paint. Then I'm ensuring that the brush is damp because it'll help me spread paint and it'll clean my brush. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of red to warm up our mixture and a little bit of Mars Black. You have to use a very small amount of Mars Black because it's very overpowering. I'm mixing this with the pigments that we were just using, and I'm trying to create a slightly darker color for the foliage and trees. These will be rendered with this old square-headed brush here. You can see that I kind of peel back the bristles, and when you make a dabbing impression mark with it, you render a litany of implications. So it's great for rendering implied trees and foliage in the distance. Here you can see that I'm doing that with a bit of a tapping motion, and it's beginning to blend in with the sky fairly naturally. That's actually what you want. You want a gradient from the sky to this color, but it's not done in a stroke and it's not a soft gradient. It's one that's done through pattern, and that pattern is this dabbing motion here. Now I'm going back and I'm trying to mix more of a similar color. So I'm using the yellow, the primary red, the titanium white to brighten it up, and a very small amount of Mars Black to darken it and further desaturate it, because the white and the black are going to desaturate the yellow and the red that we're using. It's also worth noting that we're using the red in this to warm up the pigments, because if we didn't use it, if we excluded it and we mixed the Mars Black with the yellow, they would actually form a green, and it would probably be more of a cool color, and we already have a very warm sky, right? So to ensure that the painting is cohesive, I want to ensure that the trees are also have more of a warm tone to them. So that's also something I'm trying to keep in mind. I'm not trying to go in with any cool colors at this point. I'm trying to keep it all warm and ensure that the atmosphere makes sense. So here you can see we are mixing the same color, but we're doing it in a different order this time. We used the black, the red, then we grabbed some white and some yellow. Here I'm just going back and I'm kind of fixing it up, getting it exactly how I like it. That's why blending on your palette can be such an efficient thing, because you don't have to get the color right initially. You can kind of play around with it first before you begin putting it on your canvas. And that's what I'm doing here. This mixture is a little bit more orange and red dominant, and that's actually not a bad thing. I actually really like what's going on here, because it's going to be a little bit warmer. It's going to make the scene feel, again, more cohesive. However, it's also going to add kind of an eclectic mix with our initial application, right? Because the two will almost look like they're different types of trees and different types of foliage. We're adding diversity to the piece, and that's important. However, the diversity is very, very subtle. You don't want anything stark in the background, otherwise it'll steal the attention away from the viewer's eye in the foreground. So we're trying to create differences, but we're trying to do so in a very subtle manner. And you can do that by using slightly warmer pigments here and there, and that's done by just interjecting a little bit of extra red. Now, as we move out towards the edges, as you can see here, the pigments are getting slightly darker because the foliage is slightly farther away from the sun and the light that's coming through the top. And it's important to remember to incorporate that, because only so much light can pass through foliage, and these trees and leaves will cast shadows upon one another, and it'll make them darker. It also creates a bit of an implied vignette around the piece, which, as we know, the viewer's eye will innately go to the brightest portion in the painting. So if you can kind of make the edges a little bit darker, it ensures the eye stays in that middle portion, because it won't wander into a darker area, generally. Now here, we're going back and we're still just mixing more similar pigments. Here I'm adding some highlights to the tops of the more pinkish red trees. And now you can really see a good mixture of trees. The ones that are very far away are a little bit more yellow, maybe have a little bit of green in them. Then we have some orange ones. Now we have some that are kind of akin to a pink. And we're building it up, but it's all very slight. It's all very, very subtle. And what's great about this is if you're not great at color mixing yet and you can't continuously mix the same color over and over, that's not a bad thing. You don't have to here. In fact, again, it's advantageous if you don't, but it's good practice to try to do so anyway and then maybe alter it slightly. Here I'm using a little bit more of an orange heavy mixture, so the red and the green are blending together, but it's a little bit darker as well. So again, it's interesting and it adds that vignetting effect. I'm still applying a lot of this in that tapping motion, and something that can also kind of aid the painting is if you rotate your brush in the air after each impression. That'll ensure that the application is always changing and your subject is always evolving. It'll keep it very diverse. There you saw that I made the edge of our trees quite dark, and I'm continuing to do that. However, it's still very far away from black. It's just dark relative to the rest of the painting. We're going to save our true blacks and true dark colors for the foreground, where we want a high contrast, where we really want the viewer to keep their eye. So that is the start of our sky. Now we're going to move on to some rock, and I'm going to do so in the stone wall. We are using the larger square-headed brush. You saw that I was ensuring that it was a little bit clean, that it was damp so we can spread the paint fairly well. I'm grabbing some Mars black, some titanium white, and some of the yellow that we used for the sky, as well as some of the orange that we used for the trees. I'm interjecting these additional colors into the gray and the stone because the light from the sky is going to reflect upon everything. So everything's going to absorb and reflect these colors. So it's important to work them in so that, again, the piece stays very cohesive. Here you can see that the square-headed brush is doing a good job of blocking in these larger areas because it does hold a lot of paint, but it's also fantastic because it does have those sharp, large edges. So it allows me to work fairly delicately and consistently through these more geometric, solidified shapes, right? Generally, you want to use square-headed brushes for things that have sharp edges, and you want to use round-headed brushes for things that are more soft and feathered, like clouds. We also can use the square-headed brush for clouds, but they might look a little bit more tight, a little bit more sharp. If you're going to do that, I'd probably implore you to do it in a painting where the sky is really more so your main subject. And of course, painting techniques, it's all very subjective. Different things work for different people. So just because I advise you against something doesn't mean you can't do it or doing it is wrong. It might be great for you, and half the fun of painting is the exploring. So don't get discouraged, and if you are doing something that I advise against but you like it, keep on doing it. Now I added a little bit of a darker pigment to the bottom of the stone and I blended it up. I did this because that area won't be receiving as much light as the top areas, and because there will be a lot more shadows of the bushes and trees and foliage on it. Now I'm going back to my older square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to map in the background here. Now, we do still want to save all of our starker colors for the foreground, and the background does need to remain fairly consistent tonally and with all our color and all of that. So I'm using fairly similar colors, and I'm blocking in an area that could be grass, could be bushes, could be additional foliage, but it all blends together, and that's important. I went with a color that was closer to a green because it might be grass or that sort of thing, and it divides the pink and the orange that we have right above it. Here you can see I am interjecting a little bit of additional orange though, because I felt that they were kind of too separated, and I wanted something to meld them together. So right here, we're doing a lot of trial and error. We're having some fun with it. And it's also worth noting that we're using a little bit of black, and black can be a very deceiving color when you're painting because it's so reflective. You don't really have a proper understanding in the moment of what it's going to look like. So you kind of have to trust yourself and let it dry. If it's not what you like, then you go back and you add an additional application. But right there, I think we're off to a great start. We kind of have a shadow from one of the bushes blending backwards over the grass. And so you can kind of see that light reflecting on the grass to the far left-hand side and the shadow on the right. It just makes it a little bit more captivating. Then I'm switching over to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm mixing up a bit of a darker gray here. Now I'm working on the finer details of our brick wall here, and we will be adding some bricks into this, but we need to build up the foundation first. That's very much what painting is about. It's layering foundations and then building on top of them. It's getting things ready and prepped, and then making them beautiful. So that's really what we're doing here. Is anything really finished? No, the answer is never, not really, until the painting's about 90% finished, because that's when you go in, you add the touch-ups, you add all the things that really make it stand out and be beautiful. So there is a level of patience required with this medium. But I made those underlayers for the railings a little bit darker. Now we're going to make a siding for the tops of these stone pieces. And I'm doing that in a bit of a brighter color. Now I kind of wish that I interjected a little bit of additional yellow or orange into this, because it is very neutral and arguably looks a little bit cool in this setting. It's not the worst thing because it means that it stands out. But here you can see that I did remember I threw in a little bit of that additional yellow, and I much prefer this. I feel like it has a much better fit in the atmosphere, and because of that I'm actually going to go back and add that back in to the other railing, even if it's just a little bit. And when I'm adding these colors into subjects in the foreground that don't have these colors innately, I'm doing it very subtly, but subtly does so much. So don't feel like you have to overdo it. Start with a little bit. If you feel it needs more, add a little bit more. But gradually decreasing the amount of that background color as you move forward is important. You want it to act as a gradient almost, where everything in the background is very much saturated, but in a very desaturated way. It's all very much consuming that background color. As you move forward, things get more of their innate coloring. So from there, I'm still working on this little stone area. This portion is going to be a lot darker because it's going to be cast in shadow. No sunlight is going to be reaching it, and it's not going to be getting a lot of reflective light either. We are using the smaller square-headed brush because it can hold a good amount of paint, and those sharp edges are fantastic for working around these very man-made sharp edges as well. So that's what I'm doing there. This is also a place where you might want to make the bottom a little bit darker than the top, because again, while reflected light isn't going to be there much, it might be, and if it is, it's going to be so at the top. So we're just making all of these very subtle, very intricate little pieces. And subtlety, if you incorporate it in every piece of the painting, it will be miles better at the end. So that's really what this lesson is about. It's working with a lot of subtlety in each of your smaller subjects and applications. It's also worth noting that I'm continuously going back to my water and ensuring that my brush is relatively damp. I'm doing this because otherwise we get a very grainy, granular effect with our brush. We'd see a lot of the canvas showing through, and that isn't really my intention here, not at least with the initial coverage. That is an effect that can look great on brick, on stone, on all of this type of subject, but you need to cover the canvas first, and that's what we're doing. So we're getting a nice smooth application for the most part at the start here, and then later on we can go back in with more of a dry brush and get that gritty, granular effect that stone generally has. But the water's making it so that we can do consistent blends as it keeps the wet paint wet longer, and it ensures that we're able to get more of a fine detailed application. Also worth noting, I'm continuously going back to my brush and grabbing additional paint, because when you try to scrape on paint with your brush and you apply more pressure to get more paint on there, the bristles expand, and that can be a real issue, because then the application you're making gets larger and larger and you lose control of it. So you really want to use a softer touch for a lot of these applications, and you do so by having to go back to your palette more frequently because you need more excess paint. We're not working with all of the paint on our brush, we're working with the excess paint on our brush. Here we're working on the siding. This is an area that's going to be receiving a lot more light, and so because it's going to be more so directly impacted by the light in the background, I did add in a little bit of additional yellow and orange just to make it fit a little bit better. Here you can see we're grabbing that real highlighted pigment and I'm adding that to the side. I'm doing it in a bit of a tapping motion so we get a bit of a slightly rougher aesthetic than we would have if we did a straight line down. Then I'm kind of blending the paint backwards just a little bit to show that the light is wrapping itself around this column here. And that's really what dictates depth in paintings, right? It's having an area that's a little bit darker than a middle tone, than a light tone, and the hundreds of millions of variations in between. It's light wrapping around subjects. So that's what we're trying to work with here. Now, these portions of the tops of our stone pieces are going to be a lot darker because there isn't going to be much light hitting them. But I'm also making it a little bit darker because I want it to stand out from the stone underneath it. And that might not initially make sense in our heads, like why is that darker if the lighting's similar? It could just be a different type of stone, right? One that receives and reflects light in a slightly different manner. So you can take artistic liberties like that because things like that do exist. Just like we took artistic liberties with the trees in the background being different colors. We could chalk that up to not being able to mix the same color over and over again, or we're just making it more interesting because there is diversity, and diversity makes paintings so much more interesting as a whole on almost every subject. Now we are going to continue to work on our bricks. I'm going to do so with my smaller square-headed brush. I'm grabbing some primary red, I'm grabbing some titanium white, some primary yellow, mixing those all together, and then beginning to apply our bricks very, very sharply. As you can see, the brick is essentially the size of my brush. I'm leaving a little bit of space in between, and the color that I mixed is very similar to the wall. They don't stand out enough. So I decided to brighten them up a bit. There I grabbed some titanium white, and here I'm reapplying the pigment, and as you can see, it's much more noticeable now. Here, I'm beginning on my second line of bricks, and if you find that they're a little bit too gritty, if you're not retaining the form and the shape that you'd like, then I'd simply implore you to add more water to your brush, as it'll make this process much more simple. Here, we're moving down to the third row, and as you can see, we're trying to make the layering of the bricks slightly inconsistent. The opening in between each of them differs in each row, and that way we get more of an interesting eclectic look in how it's all stacked and put together. Now, much like the background and how the colors changed slightly, we're also going to do that with the bricks as well. Sometimes they're going to have a little bit more yellow, a little bit more green, a little bit more orange, a little bit more pink. It's going to be diverse, and I'm kind of working my way around it. This is going to make it interesting. However, you could also go with a much more neutral looking brick if you find that this is a little bit too vibrant for you, if it's perhaps not as realistic as you'd like. You could mix more of a lighter gray in this scenario, but if you'd like to kind of work in a bit of additional color, I would definitely choose these colors as they do match the rest of the painting. So here we're continuously going back, remixing those colors, adding more into our space here, and I'm getting a little bit more quick with my brush as I get more confident. When you're just beginning this process, take your time, and maybe even lean your hand on your canvas or your pinky finger just to kind of ground it. That way you get the very smooth, sharp application that you require. But as you get a hang of it, you can move a little bit more quickly. Maybe you don't need that additional support. Now I also am going over to the other side here, and I'm doing the same thing. Here, however, because of the angle of my hand, the spaces in between each brick are going to be a little more diagonal. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It does give it a little bit of additional character. However, you do want your two sides to match relatively well. So it's just something to consider. If you find that moving from one side to the other, that you're kind of working on a strange angle and you're not getting these straight lines you may have initially been working with and desire to render now, then I would just move your positioning or the positioning of the canvas, and that should kind of aid you in that. Here we're going back, we're mixing more pigment, and I didn't grab enough water in this area, and I'm pressing harder with my brush than I should, and it's expanding the bristles, making each brick larger than it should be. As you can see, there are significantly more bricks on the left-hand side. And I thought about fixing this, covering it up, showing you how to do it right like we did on the left side. But in reality, we all forget different techniques from time to time. We get impatient, we make mistakes, and that's all right. Because we can go back in, we can fix things, and our paintings really don't have to be absolutely perfect. Here I'm mixing up a darker gray. I'm going to let my bricks dry, and while I do that, I'm just going to kind of fix up the post here and ensure that it has a little bit more depth. This is just going to separate it from the illuminated side and give it a little bit more depth and perception over there. Then, going back to my palette, getting a bit of a darker pigment and filling in the other post as well. Sometimes when you're working with acrylic paints, you'll have to go back and work on varying areas because acrylic paints dry semi-transparently, and you might not get that full opaque look that you want, especially if you're using a lot of water, as that does thin it, and in areas where you require a sharp application like that, you do require a good amount of water. So when you're waiting for things like your bricks to dry, you can go back and fix stuff like that. Here I'm going in and I'm just kind of adjusting the separation between each brick and cleaning it up a little bit. It's going to scale down the size of the bricks minorly, and it's going to make them look a little bit more like they did on the left. Again, we all make mistakes, we all forget things, but with acrylic paints, it's very easy to fix. We just need to wait a minute, minute and a half, let it dry, and then go back to it and give it another shot. So that's what I did there. Now here I'm adding in a bit of an additional highlight to a lot of my bricks. However, I'm doing this with more of a dry brush, and you can see that the effect I'm rendering over our base layer is a little bit more grainy. I didn't want to do this with the initial layer because it doesn't present a solid shape. So we implemented the shape and the defined edges with the initial application and color. And with this application, we're kind of adding in the texture and we're brightening it up minorly as well. Now, you might not want them to stand out to this extent. This is entirely subjective. It's entirely up to you. Again, maybe you don't want them that bright. Maybe you don't want them that saturated. Make them the way you'd like to make them. But this is essentially the process, regardless of how bright or dark or what type of color you use for them. This is just the technique in implementing bricks into a piece. This is actually really fun for me too, because in the 10-minute paintings on the channel, we generally focus almost entirely on nature and landscapes. And while this is nature and landscapes, it also has this very human element in it too, this very structural piece. So it's nice to kind of work with that now and then as well. If you have any ideas about kind of nature and creations like this in the future, let me know in the description, maybe bridges or different things like that. It is something that interests me, and it is something I'd kind of like to dive into at a point. Right here, as you can see, I'm just kind of adding additional highlights to the tops of all of our stonework, and I was just doing a lot of it at once so that it was very cohesive and the application along all of it matched. Then I'm going to my old square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to work on the background again just a little bit more, building that up because, if you remember, we incorporated some black and I wasn't really able to see the true color because of its reflective nature. So now that I did, I'm kind of going back, I'm interworking a little bit of additional orange, creating this line of additional bushes and foliage. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of black and ensure the bottom portion's slightly darker. I did this because, of course, the light's only going to be truly penetrating the top of it, and there are going to be much more shadows down around the base of the bush and tree line. So that's something that's very consistent. We did that in the bushes, we did that in the trees, we also did that in the rock. Now we're going to actually move back to our grass at the back of the painting. I'm going to do so with the old square-headed brush, and I'm going to mix up a green. However, this green does have a little bit of orange, as you can see, and so I need to make it a little bit more green. So I added black, and that black is going to mix with the primary yellow and render more of what I'd actually really like to use here. However, it's good that the orange is in that because it ensures that the background of this grass is warm, as the background does need to contain those colors. Now, we use the tapping effect with this brush, generally when we want to render foliage, right? Because we want all of these implications. However, when the grass is this distant, you're really not going to see a lot of detail, so you might be able to kind of scrape it on horizontally. Here I'm doing a lot of a tap and drag effect. So I'm applying the brush to the canvas, I'm dragging down 2-3 millimeters maybe, and then I'm lifting it up and doing that again. And this is just going to give us the impression of long grass in the far distance. It isn't detailed, it doesn't really stand out much, but you kind of just get the idea of the implication of it. And in the background, generally an implication is really all you want. As we move closer here in the foreground, things will get a little bit darker as we move farther away from the light, and we'll get more of the natural innate coloring. So here I'm grabbing a lot of black, a lot of primary yellow, and a tiny bit of red to warm it up. But as you can see, because our mixture is now so dominantly black and yellow, we're getting much more of a vibrant color. So that's what I'm applying right here. This will, however, be the base layer, and we will build a lot of detail on top of it. And so in this application, we're not really looking to render anything complex or heavily interesting. We're just looking to build something that we can apply paint on top of. We need the right values and we need a good saturation, but these are going to be darker because we're going to be applying our highlights on top of them. So that's what I'm doing. Then I threw some black at the back of all of this because, again, the light will catch the sides and top of it, but as it descends downwards, so does the light. Now here I'm grabbing some primary yellow, good amount of primary red, made it a little bit more orange than I wanted, so I'm just kind of continuously fixing things. Then I grabbed some black. As you can see, it mixed with the more dominant yellows, and we got something more akin to a green. I'm now dabbing on some highlighted areas, or rather midtones. We'll definitely go back in with some truer, brighter colors, but in the meantime, it's good. Here, I'm grabbing some additional Mars black, and I'm going to begin working on the other side. I'm doing this as opposed to fully finishing the right side, so that I ensure that I'm using the same colors on both sides. You don't want to finish one area perfectly, move over to the next, forget how to mix that color, and then end up with two very different sides of your painting. So by doing this, we ensure that they are going to be cohesive, that they are going to fit together in the way that they need to, and it's efficient because we already have the color right there. So there you can see that I'm going back, I'm doing this dabbing motion, and much like the right-hand side of the screen, I'm just building up right now a background to kind of work on top of. The foliage, the bushes, the grass, all of it that's closest to the pathway in the middle is going to be brighter because the light's going to be shining through this opening here, and that's all going to be illuminated. However, as you move more to the left and to the right, it's going to get darker. And that's also great because it aids our vignetting effect that we talked about initially when we were working on the trees. It creates a darker edge around the middle to ensure that the viewer's eye doesn't kind of wander off in one direction or the other. It stays fairly central as we'd like it to. Now here I'm applying a fairly dark green, again building up that initial layer which we will build our midtones and highlights on later. And here you can see that we're mixing up a bit of a brighter color. I wanted to work on some grass, and I want it to be a slightly brighter version than our bushes. So this is still our bottom layer. It isn't our final layer, it isn't our highlighted layer, but it is going to be brighter than the bushes. So it's important to recognize that not everything has the same base value, how dark it is, even if it's the same color. So that's kind of what I'm doing there. Then I'm moving back over to the right side and applying grass as well for the same reason we initially did with the bushes. We want to ensure that our colors are matching and the painting is balanced. So now I'm taking a bit of a highlight and dabbing on those to the edges of some of our bushes and grass here on the right hand side. I was able to do that to the bushes because they had fully dried. Had we tried to do that earlier, add that highlight onto that dark base while it was still wet, we probably would have gotten a much more muted application. It would have been much more muddy and it wouldn't be as sharp as it is now. So when you move from your dark layers to your medium tone layers, you want to ensure that the base layer is dry. Then when you move from the medium to the light, you want to ensure that that medium layer is also dry. It's a process of waiting and building, because when you apply wet acrylic paint to dry acrylic paint, you can generally get much more of a detailed application and much more of the coloring that you actually intend to get. Because if you try to apply a color from your palette to the canvas on wet paint, it's not going to be the color that you had on your palette. It's going to mix, it's going to change, and you're not going to have what you thought you would. However, if you let the paint dry, you'll get a color that's very close to what you had on your palette. It won't be entirely that color because paints do dry semi-apparently and you'll be able to see through it a little bit to the bottom, but you'll get something that's much more accurate. Now here you can see that we're just continuing to add in our foliage. We're darkening the edges here. I'm building up a real bit of black and I'm applying that to the far right hand side. It's still being applied in that dabbing motion. And if you find again that you're getting a little bit too repetitive with that all of your bushes are starting to look the same or that they have the same implications and details, then just rotate your brush a little bit to the right or left every time you lift your brush off of that canvas. Then reapply it to the canvas, then lift it, turn it, apply it, and continue in that manner. It's actually very much not time consuming, despite the fact that you're throwing in an additional movement, and it very much becomes a cathartic second nature. Now we're moving down to the bottom left hand corner, and this is going to be the darkest portion of our bushes. I'm doing this to create that vignetting effect, and I'm doing this because it's farthest away from the light, and the light simply won't be able to breach it like it did all of the others. You want to generally save your darker pigments for the foreground because you want to slowly increase the contrast as you move from the background to the foreground in most landscape paintings. There are exceptions, but it's a generally good rule to work with. Now there you could see that I was trying to apply a bit of a highlight to our wet pigment, and we're getting a very desaturated highlight. It is not like what it was on our palette. And I did this to show you that you can do it. It is achievable, but it will require more layers. And, again, just because I tell you I prefer something, I like something, something's generally advised, I learned something here or there, it doesn't have to be done that way. and there are multiple ways to do literally everything in painting. Here we're applying those highlights over to a fully dried bush, and you can see that they are much brighter, that they do have much of their more natural coloring, and that we do get a bit of a sharper application over on the right-hand side. But both can work. It's up to you. I prefer doing the wet onto dry for that sort of thing. And also, here you see that I'm cleaning my brush. I've had a couple of questions from people saying that their brushes are ruined after their paintings. Make sure that you're washing your brush, if it had paint on it, every 5 minutes or so, unless it's totally clean. Otherwise, they can dry with the paint and then it's not recoverable. However, if you ensure that you get the paint off fairly quickly, then it won't dry with the paint and you'll be able to continuously use your brushes for hopefully years, as I have. Now here I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush, and I'm mixing up a brown, or something that will be akin to brown. I'm using the pigments that we've already used. I used some primary red, some primary yellow, some Mars black, some titanium white, and here these ones are a little bit more orange dominant, and that was intentional because they are a little bit farther away. They're more in the background, so we will get that yellow, that orange, that pink light kind of reflecting on them. Now, you could use burnt umber for this, a lighter burnt umber with a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red to warm it up. But I wanted to show you that it wasn't necessary in this painting. In this painting, we use browns, but we don't actually use a burnt umber, and we generally use a burnt umber. We do that for convenience. However, it isn't entirely necessary, and I thought in this lesson I'd kind of show you how we get something similar to that. Also worth noting, our minds, the way we think about things, the way things subconsciously kind of come to us, we might apply a pigment that's reminiscent of a brown to a tree, but because it's on a tree, our mind will go, oh, well then that's a brown, even though it's simply reminiscent of one. So your brain will do a lot of the work for you, and you don't actually have to get the actual proper correct color. You can play with it. You can take some artistic liberties and have some fun. Now with these, it's also important to note that the edges that are farther away from the sun, the ones that are on the backs of the trees, the areas that are not receiving a lot of light, I am applying more Mars black to that area. We're not getting a pure Mars black, it is blending a little bit, so we're not getting that true stark dark color that we are only reserving for the foreground, but it is going to make it a little bit darker, and it is going to add some depth to the trees. The sides that are closest to the sun will remain the brightest. Now I'm going over to work on a tree on the right hand side. We're still using the small square-headed brush, and why are we using that? I want you to answer that in your head right now, just judging off what we've learned in this lesson and past lessons. The answer is it has sharp edges, so it's fantastic for rendering objects that innately have sharp edges, much like trees, and it can hold a good amount of paint, more so than a small liner brush, so you aren't constantly having to kind of reload with that. So there are a number of fairly good reasons, and it's important to always think about what brush you're using and why. We could use the medium-sized square-headed brush, but it just wouldn't render as sharp details as we'd really like. So we get a lot more of an opportunity with this one. It might take a little bit longer because we might need to reload the paint slightly more frequently, but I think it's worth it in the end. Here we're going back and we're just mixing more of that brown, as you can see here, and I'm just filling it in. Remember that acrylic paints are semi-transparent, and sometimes multiple applications will be necessary to get a proper coverage that isn't transparent and you can't see the canvas through, or the initial layers of whatever you may want to be kind of covering up. Here it would look kind of awkward if we could see through portions of the tree into foliage in the background. It would look semi-transparent, semi-invisible. It wouldn't look natural or strong in the way that we want it to. Now this tree is right now a single tone, a single color, and we need to build highlights on top of it. But much like a lot of our bushes, our grass, and our stonework, we started with the darker color, and then we'll begin to build highlights on top of it. And if we want them to really stand out, then we will wait for it to be fully dry. If we want it to be a little bit more subtle, we could apply those pigments now while it's wet. That is certainly an option, especially for a subject that's more in the middle ground, because it should be a combination of the contrast that we have in the background and the contrast that we intend to have in the foreground. Not a heavy contrast, but it's also not non-existent, right? Like it is there to an extent, just not heavily. Now here I'm mixing up a lighter yellow. This is very much akin to what we used in the background and then the sky, and I'm beginning to dab on the sides of our trees. Unfortunately, my hand was kind of in the way in a lot of this. It was a very delicate movement and I needed to make sure that I had a good precision with it. I do apologize, but essentially we're just working on the side of the tree. Here you can see that I've finally moved my hand, and I'm continuing to apply my pigment with a bit of a tapping motion. So now we have that highlighted edge, and I'm kind of blend a little bit of it backwards to create a bit of a mid-tone. However, we want to be a little bit more rough with our application here. We don't want our lines to be perfectly straight, and that's because we want our tree to have a little bit of texture, a little bit of character. We want our bark on it to be a little bit more noticeable. And that's because these trees aren't too far away. They're at the point where we can begin to discern a little bit of additional detail in the piecing of it. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, if your pigment is fairly watered down so that you get a very sharp application, you may find that because we have such a dark underlayer and such a light overlayer, it might be very transparent, and if that's the case, just let it dry and then go over the edge again. This can actually be kind of advantageous because it means that you already have a mid-tone on the painting and you can leave portions of that open when you're applying your highlights, so you get an even larger range of pigments and values, which will just make your painting seem so much more three-dimensional. Through a lot of this, I'm doing a dark, a medium, and a light layer. However, the more you do, the better it will look, generally speaking, especially in the foreground. So if you have more than an hour or a good amount of time, and you're not concerned about those time constraints, then I would implore you to kind of play around with doing even more layers in between. Here I'm just taking some of that yellow that we used on the tree and I'm applying it back to the stone. That way the warm light that's touching the tree also really matches the warmer light that's touching the rock. They're very different subjects, they have very different textures. However, they do share the same light, and that is what's going to connect them within this painting. Now we're going to begin working on the ground, and we're going to do so with our medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm beginning by ensuring that it is damp, then I'm grabbing some primary yellow, some primary red, a bit of Mars black. I'm mixing all of these together right beside our initial brown so that I have a good thing to kind of work off of and check my colors from. Then once I get something I'm fairly satisfied with, I'm going to begin applying a lot of it in this myriad of horizontal strokes, as you can see, and I'm semi-blending them. When we do this with water, we tend not to blend it at all. However, this is ground, and I want there to be mounds of dirt that are kind of raised. So that's why we're applying it in that fashion. Then I'm going to take a good amount of primary yellow, some titanium white paint, a little bit of our brown, and I'm going to apply this to the back of our walkway here. And I'm doing this because it will have a lot more of that color from the sky. It'll be much more yellow, it'll be much brighter. So we're introducing that at the back and then we're blending it down into what we just applied in the more middle ground. That area, because it's farther away, it will be less detailed. You can kind of blend it with your finger or you can do more of a blend with your brush, but it should get progressively more detailed and noticeable in texture as you move forward in the walkway here. You want to start off with a very little amount and then build up. I'm also leaving openings here in the ground, and that's going to be for water that is just sitting in these different little areas as well. It'll be really beautiful to add a reflection in them, and we can also change where they are a little bit later on. But right now, we just kind of have a general idea of where we want them. It's a very malleable thing. We can throw in lots as well, but it's good to have a base point to kind of start with. Now, much like the foliage and the trees and all of that, as we get closer to the foreground, our pigments are going to get darker. So as you can see here, we moved from a fairly neutral brown, into a fairly dark brown here at the bottom area. So we moved from a light yellow to a neutral brown to a darker brown. And it should also get a little bit more rich as well as we move down here into the foreground. I'm still applying all of it in that horizontal stroke, that tapping motion that we did, and I'm still trying to render these mounds of dirt, which should get more large and detailed as we get closer to us, the viewer. Here you see that I'm continuously having to go back and remix additional paint. I'm doing it right beside the initial mixture, that way I do have a good reference point for what I really want, and it is still consisting of our Mars Black, our primary red, and our primary yellow. I applied it there. As you could see, I just kind of threw a lot of paint onto the canvas, but I will go back to it and kind of reapply it and restructure it in the application format that I really like. So that's also important to recognize. If you have a lot of paint on your brush and you kind of need less to be more delicate, you can wipe that off on your palette, or you can wipe it off on a piece of your painting and then go back and rework it, provided you'll have enough time to do that before it dries. It's kind of this little risky game that you can play if you'd like, and if you're feeling kind of confident with the subject matter that you're currently rendering. So as you can see, we now have a fairly decent base layer for our walkway here. It isn't highly detailed, it doesn't have any highlights, but it's certainly a good start. Now here I'm going to try to add a little bit of a brighter application to these mounds, and these are just areas that are catching slightly more light than the rest. It's also kind of graying down that middle area, which is going to heighten the perception of the saturation of the application in the foreground there. So we're all just kind of building it up slowly. It's also interjecting a little bit of additional yellow and even green into it, which is nice because then it also acts cohesively with the trees and the foliage that kind of surround it. We do want to use similar colors. Then I'm going to go back in and add a lighter color to the background there. That time it was fairly void of yellow as it is a little bit desaturated, but we can go back in and add that later. Right now I'm just trying to build it up and get the values that I really like. I wasn't able to do it initially in the first application because, again, acrylic paints are very thin, and sometimes with things especially like this, you will need to add multiple layers to get it the way you'd really like. I also started to wrap that pathway around some distant foliage and grass, which I hadn't initially planned on doing, but it was in the moment I saw it and I thought, you know what, we can do that. So that also goes to show you and to say, you generally should go into a painting with a plan, with an idea, with a composition, with a mood. However, if you find that something isn't working or you have a great new idea, don't be afraid to introduce it into the painting. Give it a try, give it a shot, and see, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But a lot of the times, it's a good addition to the painting and you learn something through the process, which is arguably the most important piece of all of this. So here, we've been doing a lot of applications. We've been adding these highlights in, and I'm doing so in that same manner. It's beginning to look a little bit more detailed. It's beginning to match the rest of the painting much more, and we're getting something kind of cohesive that actually fits within the rest of the context of the painting, which is really nice to see that it's all finally kind of starting to come together. It did take some time, but as we said, with acrylic paintings, time is required heavily. So now I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush. As you can see, I'm ensuring that it is damp, just like the rest of our pigments. I'm grabbing some titanium white, I'm grabbing some primary yellow, a very small amount of primary red just to warm it up, and then I'm going to begin introducing the water into our ground here. I'm doing so in the same horizontal lines that we did initially, and they really stand out. This is the water reflecting off the sky. We get this golden yellow color that looks really nice next to the greens, and it also looks really nice to our earthy tones that are the browns in the ground as well. I think when a lot of us innately think of painting water, we say, oh, well, we'll go with blue. But water is very much the reflection of the colors around it, and if the sky isn't blue and it doesn't have a surrounding blue subject, then you're probably going to want to rethink that. In this case, it was a lot of a golden yellow, so that's what we used. Now, I'm letting the application here be a little bit darker initially. We are going to build this up. We are going to add our highlights, but I'm also trying to allow my brush strokes to show through a little bit more than I did in the ground. I'm allowing them to be a little bit more straight. In the dirt, I was doing a little bit more of a bump movement. Here, it's very much strictly a horizontal movement. It's also worth noting that if you use a lot of water in this, it will be very transparent and you will definitely have to do a good number of layers. Yellow is a very transparent pigment, so this is something that you'll have to do a lot with. Different pigments have different levels of transparency, so they'll require different levels of layers, which is why we're also introducing a good amount of titanium white into this, because titanium white is a very thick pigment and generally requires much less layering than the other pigments that we use, especially the primary colors. So now we have the base down for that. I'm going to grab some additional titanium white, as you can see here, mix it into the yellow, and I'm going to reapply some highlights to our stonework. That way, this color really fits into the entirety of our painting, and the highlights that we applied earlier dried. They dried on top of darker layers, which meant that you could see through them. They were a little bit darker, so we needed to go back and reapply some highlights as well. As we build up our highlights, what we see through them is other highlights, so it actually does become the bright pigment we see on our canvas, but it does take a couple of layers. You just need to ensure that the pigments you're adding it on top of are bright and not dark. So that's why when we do layering from dark to mid-tone to light tone, it can sometimes require a number of additional layers, but I think it's a great process to kind of learn the basics of lighting and how to create a scene like this with a good amount of depth. Here I am going back into the water and I'm throwing in some little patches here and there beside different larger strands of water. And I'm doing this because I want it to look interesting. I want it to look diverse. I don't want just two streaks of water going down the road where the tires generally are. I want to ensure that the road has a much more intricacy and personality than that. Now, because we applied our road after our foliage, we covered a good amount of our foliage and we lost a good amount of detail as well. So here I'm going back in and I'm reintroducing that into our bushes with the old square-headed brush and the tapping effect that we all, I'm sure, know and love well at this point. So here I'm also grabbing some highlight and I'm reintroducing that over a little bit of the ground as well to the left-hand side. I'm trying to ensure that we don't have a stark break between the ground, the dirt, and the grass. I want it to be a little bit more staggered. I want it to be a little bit more fluid. And I'm doing this because generally it is. It isn't just pure ground and then pure grass, especially in a nature scene like this. It kind of grows over and you get a little bit of grass in the dirt and you get a little bit of dirt in the grass and you get this nice transitionary area. And that's exactly what we are attempting to render right here. But then I'm also taking that green and I'm reincorporating some highlights back into our bushes. So that's something that's very much a commonality throughout this painting. It's taking a color that we're introducing in one area and then bringing it back to another to ensure that they mix and match really well. So we do get that very cohesive painting, which we desire. Now here you can see that I'm cleaning off my brush fairly well, but I should warn you, when working with the old square-headed brush, you do need to be careful with that process, because when the old square-headed brush is very wet, the bristles tend to clump together, and then you don't render all of the impressions that you generally would because they are all stuck together. So this is a brush, this is probably the only brush where I'd generally advise you to use fully dry and then clean it when you absolutely have to, and after you clean it, dry it. With the exception, I guess, of working on the brick and the rock where you do want that gritty effect with more of a dry brush application like what we used earlier. Now here you can see that we are reapplying some additional highlights to the edges of the bushes, the areas that are going to be receiving the most light. And we're doing this again because our last set of highlights dried and then they had the darker layer underneath. So they dried semi-transparently, so they were a little bit darker than when we initially applied them or what we had on our canvas. This is just kind of fixing that and bringing it back to exactly what we wanted it to be. Also worth noting, I'm trying to ensure that all of my bushes are different from the one next to them, that they are ever evolving and changing. So that's really what we've been working on there. Now I'm going to go back to my palette. As you can see, we're mixing up a bit of a darker green, reintroducing those bottom darker areas. And that's important occasionally if you tend to overdo it with the highlights. You know, some of us will question, am I using too much highlight? Am I not using enough? Generally, I'd advise overdoing, and then if you overdo it and you don't like it, then you can go back and remedy it. You can go back and reintroduce those midtones and those dark tones. And that's just kind of what I was doing there. Now here I'm going to mix up some additional brown. We're using the Mars Black, the red, and the yellow. I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to block in my larger tree here in the foreground. Now because this tree is much closer to us, it's going to have a lot of additional detail in it, much more so than the trees in the background. However, the initial base layer is going to be fairly simple, much like the back two pieces were. We're just going to build in the silhouette essentially first, but the silhouette isn't a pure black, it is a very dark brown, and then we will begin to add on the detailed bark from there. Now I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush to fill this in, and it's very much like coloring at this point. However, if I were a little bit of a smarter man, I would probably switch to the smaller square-headed brush for the tops of the branches, because it is just such a delicate brush and you are able to get a lot more fine lines with it. So if you are doing this and you find that as you move up the tree the lines are not small enough, definitely switch to the other brush. That's actually what's kind of fun about filming this. I get to see varying things I'd change or do differently. So next time I can make you an even better tutorial and I can make myself a bit of a better painting. If you ever want to do the same thing, you could always set up your phone, or perhaps you have a camera as well, film your painting and then just watch your process back. See if there are different things that you might critique. Now I fully let my tree dry. However, as I did, I noticed that it was more and more transparent. So I needed to go back and kind of fix that up. So I grabbed that same medium-sized square-headed brush, I grabbed the same dark browns that I was using previously, and I began to kind of just color it in. However, this time I'm not using any additional water on my brush because we don't have to do these sharp edges which initially required the water because they're there. I'm more so filling in the middle portion, and that means I can do so with more of just a full opaque paint, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So while you may have to go back and redo certain layers because of a transparency issue, it's really not like repainting it in its entirety. It's generally a much easier process of just kind of filling in different areas. From there, I ensured that my brush was nice and clean as I set it down. Then I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush. I'm going to dip it in water to ensure that it is fairly wet. Then I'm going to go to my palette, grab primary blue for the first time, grab a bit of primary red to make a bit of a purple pigment. Then I'm going to thicken it by adding the titanium white. However, I do want a darker pigment for a base, so I'm going to grab some Mars Black and mix that in there as well until I get something that I feel fairly confident with. Then I'm going to be able to draw it in using the corner of my small square-headed brush. The corner of the small square-headed brush can be an incredibly great tool. It's almost like the end of a small liner brush. However, it has a lot of bristles to back it up, so it's fairly strong, where the liner brush will bend and you won't have as much delicate control with it. So here I'm drawing in some flowers, and I'm doing it with this darker blue, which we will add highlights to. However, this is the only blue that we are incorporating in the painting, so it's important that we spread it out so that it doesn't stick out fairly awkwardly. With that in mind, I'm adding it to both the left and the right-hand side of the painting. There you could see I was going back, grabbing some additional paint. I'm not trying to scrape this into the canvas. I am always ensuring that I have extra paint and that my application can remain sharp, because I'm never really pushing the brush into the canvas. I'm just letting paint touch dried paint on the canvas rather than bristle on canvas. So here I'm just going back, I'm grabbing some additional pigment. However, this time it has a little bit of a titanium white, which makes it into more of a highlight, which I'm applying in a bit of a tapping motion and giving these flowers some real character. Now, because the values are so similar to that of the surrounding area, these don't stick out too awkwardly, which might have been an issue because, again, it is the only blue in the painting. As long as your values are right and the saturation level matches that of the surrounding area, you should be in a good place. Now here, you can see that we're just continuing to tap that on the top. And as we mentioned before, almost everything in the background had this warm highlight on it, right? It was a little bit orange, it had the yellow, it had the titanium white. And as we move forward in the painting, that dissipates and dissipates and dissipates. So now that we're in the real foreground, we can begin to work with colors that are void of that, much like the blue. Here, we're introducing a bit of a red flower as well, because we do want some diversity. The shape of this flower is going to be massively different from the one that we just rendered, and I'm doing so still with the corner of the smaller square-headed brush. This is being done with a titanium white and a primary red. I'm beginning to create clusters with these, as you can see, and every cluster should be fairly different. You want these to be evolving, you want different spaces between each of them, you want highlights on different areas of them, and this can be done just through sporadically, cathartically applying these in a more random style. However, I'm going to apply them in a number of different areas. There you can see 3 clusters, which is nice. It's generally good to work with odd numbers when rendering smaller subjects in painting, such as 3, 5, 7, and 9. There, I even threw a couple in the top, or rather bottom right-hand corner, just to kind of balance things out a little bit more. Now, those reds are very desaturated because of all of the titanium white that we incorporated, but that's good because they are closer to the background and the warmer light, so it's okay if they're washed out a little bit. Then I decided to add in an additional little tree or large bush, if you will. I'm using the smaller square-headed brush. It has a lot of water on it because I do want to make very fine lines, and I'm beginning this tree by implementing very small applications. And that's really how I'd implore you to do most of your trees. Start with a small base and then build it up. Then add another layer if you think it needs it, then add another couple millimeters to it if you think it needs it, and just continue to expand it. But it's much easier to add more to a tree when you have a finished background than it is to work reductively and repaint in the background around it. So that's generally my process for working on smaller trees and detailed things like this in the foreground. At first, less is more, then add more. So here we are just kind of expanding. I'm going over areas a couple of times because I am using a good amount of water and I do know that they will be semi-transparent. Now, because it is so wet, it's also important that we fully let this dry before we go in and add any foliage, because otherwise it would all blend together and get fairly muddy and dirty, which really isn't what we want. In the meantime, I'm going to mix up that very warm color that we used for the sky, and I'm going to begin working on the tree. I'm actually just tapping on the highlights to the edges of the trees. And I really am doing a lot of a tapping. I think a lot of us innately feel the need to kind of run the brush down the edge of the tree to add the highlight, and then we kind of blend it. However, when a tree is really in the foreground, you're going to want to work with a good amount of detail. You're going to want to ensure that different pieces of the bark are highlighted at different places and areas. So I'm doing a tapping motion and highlighting each individual piece, as you can see here. We also want to incorporate different openings. We want some pieces of bark to be larger than others, and we're just going to slowly add to it. Now here I mixed up a bit of a neutral tone. It's right in between the dark tone and the highlight, and I'm beginning to add that behind the highlights. That way we have our dark tone, our middle tone, and our highlight. I also added it, and really only it, to the bottom of the tree, because that area won't be receiving as much light as the top of it, because the stone is going to block a good amount of that light as well, even if it doesn't render a hard shadow. Now here you can see that I'm getting a bit of a darker brown yet again, and I'm going to begin working on a second small tree over here to the left. So I decided I wanted a couple of them, and this is something that's great to add a little bit of additional detail into your painting, because we can also add on foliage and additional colors. Now, this isn't something that was initially part of the plan, but once I added the first one, I thought, you know what, we could do a little bit of duality here. It could match really nicely, and it could frame the painting as well. So again, it's great to go into these with a plan. However, if you have an additional idea or you want to kind of stray and take a little bit of additional artistic liberty, you should go ahead and try these things. So there I have that. It's not overly complicated. If we need additional branches later on, I will go in and add them. However, I do like that as an initial base to kind of work off of. Now here I'm going to grab some titanium white paint, and I'm going to begin drawing on some foliage. We can work in some additional color in a little bit, but it's good that this is dry, otherwise we would have had a brown flower color which just would have matched and not been what we liked. So here, much like our flowers on the ground, I'm trying to create different clusters of them in different shapes and sizes, and in doing so we will render something that's a little bit more interesting. Now it's worth noting that we're adding a fairly light petal color on top of a fairly light brick color, which means that there isn't a heavy contrast, and neither of which will really stand out. However, that isn't really necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you want pieces of your painting to kind of blend together optically, that way they aren't too stark and overwhelming. However, if you really wanted your petals and flowers to stand out here, and you've already done a brighter background, you could go with a much darker petaled flower. Maybe you went with a nice rich dark blue or a darker red. Those would stand out. However, I'm doing it in a much more subtle fashion just because I don't want these to grab all of the viewer's attention. I want them to kind of aid it instead. Here I'm adding a similar pigment. It's a pink over to the bush on the far left-hand side, and I'm applying these flowers to the areas that we can see to the far left, but also a little bit to the right on the other side of the tree. And by having the tree in front of them, we illustrate a lot more depth within the painting. So that's also something to consider when you're doing things like this. You can create depth by having pieces in the foreground kind of interrupt the spacing and break it up, because that automatically shows you that one thing is in front of the other. Now here I'm just going back in and adding some saturation into the foliage that we just rendered. And I'm doing this with more of a primary red. I want some of the flowers to stick out more than others, and this will just add a little bit of depth to that area and that piece. It'll also help it stand out without being too much of a heavy contrast and too overwhelming. Then I'm going to take that smaller square-headed brush, ensure it's clean, grab some titanium white paint, and begin to apply some highlights to our water down here. And I'm doing this in horizontal strokes. I'm also trying to ensure that the application dissipates on both the initial stroke and at the end of the stroke. So I want it to kind of fade in, go into a more opaque pigment, and then fade out yet again. That way we get something that's a little more water-like, a little more transparent, a little more smooth. Now I'm going back and I'm adding additional highlights to our tree on the far left, and it's good to go back and forth like this. We talk about this with a lot of these different materials and pieces. We start with a little bit and we see if we like it. Give it 5 minutes, give it 10 minutes. And generally our perception changes just through that short little period of time, which is good because it allows us to adjust, work on other things, and then come back when we need to. Here I'm going to work in some additional little strands that are going to be pieces of this tree. And these are great because they are going to work in a little bit of extra depth in the painting because we can weave them in and out of the foliage which we just rendered. But it also gives us more space to add additional foliage should we want to. So I'm doing these in the same way that we did before. The brush is very wet, and I'm trying to create as small of an application as I possibly can. I'm being very delicate. I'm not applying much pressure, if any, with the brush, and I'm just allowing the paint to touch the paint. When you do this, you're also going to want to be fairly certain that the areas you're working over and around are very dry. Otherwise, you will blend and mix with the lighter pigments and you won't get the dark bark that you really want and desire. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom left-hand corner and work in some added flowers as well. Now, this is an area where we really have an opportunity to build up a great contrast, because here we really do have the darkest portions of the painting. So if you add a light pigment beside it, it's going to look very bright in comparison, and it's really going to capture the viewer's eye, as you can see here. Whereas with the background, it's almost all bright. It's almost washed out. So the eye doesn't really stay there because it doesn't have the contrast. When something is very dark and it has a little bit of light next to it, that light looks so much brighter. And the same goes in reverse. So here, we're really ensuring that we can capture the viewer's attention in the foreground. So I also added in some highlights of the white to ensure that I could do that. I'm still using the smaller square-headed brush, and here I'm just going to add some additional highlights to the blue flowers that we have as well, because when we added all of the additional highlights to the other flowers, these ones began to look a little out of place because they didn't have the same level of highlight as everything else. So that's really why we need to continuously go back in the painting and readjust things that we feel may have been finished or well done, because we do need to ensure that they're cohesive with the rest of the painting, and that's exactly what we did there. Here you can see that I'm washing my brush off rather well, as we generally do. Then I'm grabbing some primary red, moving that down to the area where we generally do our pink, and I'm going to actually reapply that to our tree and just create something that's a little bit more stark. We're slowly just building up the color and reintroducing the saturation into these areas. I wanted to do it subtly, and this is generally the best way to do it. Generally we do dark to light, but here we're doing desaturated to saturated. Now we are really at a cathartic process in the painting, and that is working on the foliage in the tops of the trees. I'm going to begin by grabbing a good amount of primary yellow, a little bit of primary red, and some Mars black. Then I'm going to begin applying it in that same tapping fashion that we worked on with the bushes. I'm trying to leave lots of openings to ensure that the sky and bark and trees and everything in the background still shows through. I don't want just one giant blob of this application. I want it to look like this foliage is leafing off the tree, that it exists in different clusters and different shapes and sizes, that different amounts of light are penetrating different areas in different ways. I want it to be diverse and interesting. So when you're doing this, well, it is a cathartic process. Be a little bit pragmatic about where you're incorporating these applications. I'm also trying to ensure that the top left and top right hand corner are a little bit darker, which is going to further our vignette that we talked about when we initially did the sky and when we were working on the bushes as well. Here, this is just one more way of going about doing it. This will also frame the painting really nicely and ensure that the viewer's eye goes exactly where we want it to. You see that I'm frequently going back to my palette and grabbing more additional paint, and I really think that's necessary here because we are trying to make very fine, sharp applications, and if your brush is very dry, you're probably not going to get those. You're probably going to get more gritty applications that are very thin and they're a little bit more toothy. It just won't be what you want. So when you're working in the foreground, especially on something like this, ensure that you definitely have enough paint on the canvas. Now, as you can see, with the initial applications, because we're going over lighter areas, they're a little bit brighter. And then when we reapply to it, it gets darker because we're applying a dark color over a dark color. And that actually adds a lot of depth. What you want to do is ensure that the edges and the outskirts of each cluster is a little bit brighter than that middle portion. The middle portion should be much more dense, while the outer areas should have a little bit more light moving through them and therefore be slightly brighter and more transparent even. You can actually go back in and add in some highlighted areas, and that's what I'm doing right here. As you can see, I'm just picking different areas that I think might be receiving a little bit of additional light, and I'm blocking that in with the same tapping motion that we did earlier. Now, if we wanted this to be hyper saturated or vibrant, we should have waited for this to dry completely. However, I did want this to be a little bit more muted because I didn't want the viewer's eye to go up to the top of the painting and get stuck there. This is more just to build depth than to create something that's going to hold the viewer's attention. I want that farther down within the painting. So there, we're really almost done the painting. At this point, we're really just doing different touch-ups. And for each of us, that is going to look like a different process because we all innately have our own strengths and weaknesses. However, this is a great time for reflection because all of the major elements of the painting have been completed. That much we know, that much we're far in. So now we ask ourselves, well, I like my bark, but could it be a little bit more interesting? Maybe I have an extra branch here. Maybe I put a more spacing between these two pieces of bark. Maybe I put more of a mid-tone there. You could also go back into the ground here and add little stones. And that's what I'm doing. So I mixed up this gray here, and I'm throwing in very, very small pieces, and a good number of them as well. But I also want a couple larger pieces. So there I'm going to grab some titanium white, some Mars black, and I'll draw in something that's a little bit bigger. Now, when you're drawing rocks, you want to ensure that they are also going to be always changing and evolving. You want them to be different from the ones next to them. And because these ones are a little bit larger, we are going to start with the darker base tone, then we're going to add the medium tone, and then we're going to add the lightest value on top of that. And through that, we'll be able to render a good amount of depth. Here you can see that I'm using that same brush, and I'm adding on some highlight to a couple of these right here. It's not too stark, these rocks still blend in nicely with the ground, and that's also important. When you work in something with a bit of black in it, like the rocks, make sure that it does fit within the environment. You might need to tone down the black if the environment is large and there isn't any other additional black in that area. You might need to go with a bit of a medium tone of a gray or something like that instead. Here, we could have also worked in a little bit of the golden color. However, I felt if I did that, it would blend in a little bit too much. It might have made sense, but sometimes the artistic liberties are kind of worth it, and you get a better aesthetic by doing what doesn't necessarily make sense. Here I'm doing some touch-ups on the foliage over to the left-hand side. I'm just adding in some additional highlights, and then I'm doing a couple over here on the back and the right-hand side. However, not as many, because again, it is farther away, and you don't want that area to look too stark. We're just trying to ensure that it kind of matches the aesthetic of the rest of the painting. And there we have it, our final hour-long painting. So as per usual, I hope that you enjoyed, I hope that you learned something, I hope that you go out and you create something beautiful, and at some point that you share it with me as well. I love to see what you all create. If you have any questions along the way, please let me know. I am here to help, and I can't wait to make more hour-long lessons in the future. If you liked this color palette, if you like this type of scene with the more human elements, let me know, because I would love to continue to work with them in future installments. But as always, I'm Ryan O'Rourke. I thank you so much for supporting me, for supporting this channel, for subscribing here over on Patreon. I hope that you are doing extremely well, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Thank you so much, and stay creative.